Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. It was mid-2018, and I was 23 years old when I drove down to Vermont to see my family and spend a few weeks reconnecting with the place I once called home. The drive itself took the better part of a day, winding through stretches of highway that gradually gave way to narrower roads flanked by thick walls of pine and birch. My parents still lived in the same house I'd grown up in, a modest two-story place sitting just outside the western edge of the Appalachian Mountains. The air there was different than where I live now, cleaner, heavier with moisture, carrying that particular scent of rotting leaves and damp earth that I'd forgotten I missed. Since moving out 3 years prior, I hadn't had the chance to do any real hiking or camping. City life had swallowed me whole, and the closest thing to nature I experienced anymore was the patch of grass in the park near my apartment. But out here, surrounded by endless forests that stretched toward mountains I could see from my childhood bedroom window, I felt that old familiar pull toward the wilderness. I wanted to get out there, to sleep under the stars, to feel that isolation again. Most specifically, I wanted to find a place I'd been thinking about for a long time. Just before I moved away, I'd stumbled across an online forum dedicated to people who explored abandoned structures. There, buried in a thread with only a handful of replies, someone had mentioned an old hunting lodge deep in the forest about 20 miles from my parents' property. They'd posted a rough description of how to find it. No official trail, just a path that had been worn down over the years by curious explorers like myself. The photographs they'd shared were grainy and dark, but I could make out the shape of a large wooden structure consumed by vegetation. I'd saved that thread, bookmarking it with the intention of checking the place out someday. That someday had finally arrived. On Monday morning, I loaded my car with everything I'd need for an overnight trip. Tent, sleeping bag, flashlight, LED lantern, matches, water, dried food, a small first aid kit. I told my parents I'd be back the following afternoon and drove out toward the coordinates I'd saved years ago. The drive took about 40 minutes, the roads becoming increasingly neglected until I was bouncing along a gravel path that hadn't seen maintenance in what looked like decades. I parked on the side of the road where the gravel gave way to grass and weeds. There was no trailhead marker, no sign, nothing to indicate that anything lay beyond the wall of trees. But according to my notes, the path should be right here, cutting through the undergrowth at roughly a 45-degree angle from the road. I found it after a few minutes of searching, a narrow gap in the vegetation where the ground was slightly more compressed than the surrounding forest floor. The trail was massively overgrown. Knee-high weeds choked the path, and in several places, young saplings had begun to grow right in the middle of it, forcing me to push through branches that scraped at my arms and face. It was clear that nobody had been down here in a very long time, perhaps years. The forum post I'd read was from 2016, and I wondered if I was the first person to attempt this hike since then. The thought was both exciting and unsettling. The hike took just under 2 hours. The terrain was mostly flat, which should have made it easy, but the constant struggle against the encroaching vegetation turned every step into an effort. My clothes were soaked with sweat by the time I finally saw the structure emerge from the trees ahead of me. I stopped walking and just stared at it for a moment, catching my breath while taking in the sight of something that had been sitting out here, forgotten and rotting for what had to be decades. The lodge was larger than I'd expected, a 2-story structure built from thick logs that had long since turned gray with age and weather. The roof had partially collapsed, caving in on itself in several places, leaving gaping holes through which I could see the darkening sky above. Thick vines had crawled up the walls, worming their way between the logs and spreading across what remained of the windows. Black mold bloomed in patches along the lower portions of the walls, and the smell even from 30 feet away was overwhelming. It was the smell of decay, of organic matter breaking down over years of neglect, of moisture and rot, and something else I couldn't quite identify. My original plan had been to camp inside the lodge. I'd thought it would be an interesting experience, sleeping in an abandoned building in the middle of nowhere, protected from the elements by walls that had stood for who knew how long. But standing here now, looking at the structural damage, the collapsed sections, the way certain walls seemed to be leaning at angles that defied physics, I knew that wasn't going to happen. This place wasn't safe. It looked like it could come down at any moment. The front door was wide open, hanging at an angle from a single remaining hinge. I approached cautiously, stepping over debris that had accumulated on the small porch and peered inside. The smell was significantly worse here, thick and organic, coating the inside of my throat. I had to breathe through my mouth to avoid gagging. The interior was dark despite the holes in the roof, the trees surrounding the structure blocking most of the fading sunlight. I could make out a main hallway stretching toward the back of the building, its floor covered with fallen ceiling material, broken furniture, and what looked like years of accumulated leaves and dirt. At the far end of the hallway, I spotted a door that appeared to be intact. It was closed, and unlike everything else in this place, it seemed to be in relatively good condition. I wanted to get to it, to see what was behind it, but the path was treacherous. Large sections of the floor had given way, revealing black holes that dropped into what I assumed was a basement or crawl space. The walls were unstable, some of them bulging inward as if the entire structure was slowly being crushed by some invisible force. I took a few tentative steps inside, testing the floor with each footfall, but when I felt the boards beneath me flex and heard a low groan from somewhere in the structure, I backed out. It wasn't worth dying over. With the lodge ruled out as a shelter, I needed to find somewhere else to set up camp. The sun was already beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that filtered weakly through the canopy above. I had maybe an hour of usable daylight left, probably less given how thick the trees were in this area. I walked about 200 feet from the lodge, putting enough distance between myself and the unstable structure that I wouldn't have to worry about it collapsing on me in the night. The spot I found wasn't ideal. The ground was uneven and covered with roots and rocks, but it was the best option available. I spent 20 minutes clearing away debris, kicking aside fallen branches and using my boots to flatten the taller weeds until I had a roughly tent-sized patch of relatively level ground. Setting up the tent took another 15 minutes. By the time I finished, the sun had dropped below the tree line, and the forest was growing dark with alarming speed. I gathered what dry wood I could find and built a small campfire about 10 feet from my tent, nursing the flames until I had a decent blaze going. The warmth was comforting, as was the light. It pushed back the darkness to a radius of maybe 20 feet, beyond which the forest became an impenetrable wall of black. I'd wanted to stargaze. That had been part of the appeal of camping out here, away from the light pollution of civilization. But the trees towered above me, their branches interweaving into a ceiling that blocked most of the sky. What little I could see was partially obscured by clouds that had rolled in during the afternoon. So instead, I sat on a fallen log near my fire, throwing sticks into the flames and letting my mind wander. I thought about my childhood, about all the times I'd camped in these woods with my father, about how different the forest had felt back then. Safer, somehow, more familiar. I don't know how long I'd been sitting there when I heard it. Maybe an hour, maybe longer. The fire had burned down to a steady glow, and I'd been lost in thought, staring at the embers without really seeing them. Then the sound cut through the quiet of the night, and I snapped back to full awareness. It was loud, much louder than I would have expected. A deep, straining noise like wood being bent beyond its capacity, like something massive was being twisted or compressed. The sound lasted for maybe 4 or 5 seconds, rising in pitch before abruptly stopping. And even though I couldn't see the lodge anymore, even though it had been swallowed by the darkness, I knew with absolute certainty that the sound had come from that direction. I sat frozen, my heart hammering against my ribs. The forest around me had gone quiet. The crickets that had been providing a constant backdrop of noise had fallen silent. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. I strained my ears, listening for anything, a follow-up sound, footsteps, voices, but there was nothing. Just silence, so complete it felt physical, pressing against my eardrums. Maybe it was just the old wood settling, I told myself. The structure was clearly unstable, barely holding together. It made sense that it would creak and groan, especially at night when the temperature dropped. Old buildings did that. It was perfectly normal. But the silence that followed wasn't normal. The forest shouldn't be this quiet. I sat and listened for what felt like an eternity, but was probably closer to 30 minutes. Nothing else happened. The crickets eventually resumed their chirping, hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence. The wind picked up again, rustling the leaves above me. Everything returned to normal, or at least what passed for normal out here. but I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep if I didn't check on it. The lodge was only a couple 100 feet away, hidden by darkness but still close enough that whatever had made that sound was essentially my neighbor for the night. If there was something wrong, if someone was out there, or if the structure was actively collapsing, I needed to know. I added more wood to my fire before leaving, building it up enough that it would still be burning when I returned. Then I grabbed my LED lantern and started walking in the direction of the lodge. The darkness beyond my campfire's glow was absolute. My lantern threw a small circle of light around me, maybe 15 feet in diameter, beyond which I could see nothing. The trees emerged from the blackness as I approached them, their trunks appearing suddenly in my light like figures stepping out of hiding. I walked slowly, carefully, my feet finding roots and rocks that I couldn't see until I was already stumbling over them. After about a minute, the lodge materialized in my lantern's glow. It was worse at night. The shadows filled every gap and hole in the structure, turning the ruin into something that looked almost organic, like a massive creature curled up in the forest and waiting. The broken windows stared out at me like empty eye sockets. The vines covering the walls writhed slowly in the wind, creating the illusion of movement, of breathing. I approached the front of the building, my lantern held high, and then I stopped. The door was closed. I stood there staring at it, trying to process what I was seeing. I had been here less than 2 hours ago. I had looked inside. The door had been wide open, hanging from a single hinge, unable to close even if someone had wanted to close it. But now it was shut. Firmly, completely shut. I took a step closer, and that's when I noticed the scratches. They covered the entire front face of the door. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Long, jagged marks that looked like they'd been made by fingernails or possibly a knife. Some of them were deep, gouging into the wood. Others were shallow, barely visible. They overlapped each other in chaotic patterns, concentrated most heavily around the door handle and the edges of the frame, as if someone had been desperately trying to claw their way through. I hadn't noticed these scratches before. Had they been there when I first arrived? Had I simply missed them in my initial examination? Or were they new? Had someone or something made them in the 2 hours since I'd been here? My hands were shaking as I reached for the door handle. I don't know why I did it. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave, to turn around and walk away and never come back. But I had to know. I had to understand what was happening. I tried to push the door open. It didn't budge. I pushed harder, putting my shoulder into it. The door held firm. It felt like something was on the other side. Something heavy, pressing against the door and holding it shut. I backed away quickly, nearly tripping over my own feet. The lantern shook in my grip, sending wild shadows dancing across the front of the lodge. I didn't stay any longer. I turned and rushed back into the forest, toward my campsite, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I moved as quickly as I could through the darkness, my lantern swinging wildly and casting chaotic light across the trees. I was disoriented, unsure if I was heading in the right direction. My only reference point the vague memory of which way I'd come. But as I pushed through the undergrowth, I realized something was wrong. I should have been able to see the glow of my campfire by now. I'd built it up before leaving, added enough wood that it should still be burning strong, but there was nothing ahead of me except darkness. No warm orange glow filtering through the trees. No dancing shadows cast by flames. I started moving faster, almost running now, branches whipping at my face and arms. Then I burst into the small clearing where I'd made camp, and I stopped dead. The fire was out. Not burned down. Not reduced to embers. Out. Completely extinguished. A thin column of smoke rose from where the fire had been, dissipating into the night air. The logs I'd added were still there, still arranged in the same pattern, but they were cold, not even warm to the touch when I reached down toward them with trembling fingers. Someone had put out my fire. Someone had been here, in my camp, while I was at the lodge. I straightened up and held my lantern high, turning in a slow circle and scanning the tree line. The darkness pressed in from all sides, impenetrable beyond the small pool of light from my lantern. I couldn't see anyone, couldn't see anything except trees and shadows and more darkness. "Hello?" My voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. I cleared my throat and tried again, louder this time. "Hello? Who's out there?" Silence. The forest offered no response. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only a minute or two. My lantern held high, my eyes straining against the dark. Nothing moved, nothing made a sound. Then I heard it. Laughing. It was quiet, so quiet I almost missed it beneath the hammering of my own heartbeat. A soft, breathy sound, like someone chuckling under their breath. It was coming from somewhere in the trees to my left, maybe 20 or 30 feet away. I spun toward the sound, thrusting my lantern in that direction. Who's there? Who is that? The laughing stopped. The forest was silent again. But I knew with a certainty that made my stomach turn, that someone was out there. Someone was watching me from behind those trees, watching me and laughing softly to themselves, like this was all some twisted game they were playing. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I just acted. I started shoving things into my backpack. Whatever I could grab. Whatever was within reach. I left the tent. I left the sleeping bag. I left anything that wasn't immediately essential because I knew in that moment that I needed to get out of these woods as fast as humanly possible. The trail back to my car was a 2-hour hike in daylight. At night, with only a small LED lantern to guide me, through overgrown vegetation I could barely see. I had no idea how long it would take, but I knew I couldn't stay here. I couldn't spend the night in this forest with someone watching me, laughing at me, playing games with me in the dark. I found the trail and started moving. Walking at first, then faster, almost jogging. My lantern bounced with each step, the light swinging wildly and making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Branches scratched at my face, roots caught at my feet. I stumbled multiple times, nearly falling, but I kept moving. Several times I stopped. I heard it again, that soft laughing, somewhere behind me, somewhere in the darkness, close enough to hear, but never close enough to see. Whoever was following me was good. They knew these woods, knew how to move through them without being spotted. They were playing with me, staying just out of sight, letting me know they were there but never showing themselves. I tried not to think about what would happen if they caught me. I tried not to think about why someone would be living out here, in an abandoned lodge in the middle of nowhere. I tried not to think about those scratches on the door, about what could have made them, about what might be behind that closed door in the darkness. I just kept moving. The hike back to the road took almost 3 hours. 3 hours of stumbling through darkness, of hearing that quiet laughter drift through the trees behind me, of fighting the urge to just drop everything and run blindly into the night. When I finally burst out of the forest and saw the gravel road ahead of me, saw my car sitting exactly where I'd left it, I nearly collapsed with relief. I didn't look back. I got in my car, started the engine, and drove away. I drove until I couldn't see the forest in my rearview mirror anymore, until I was back on paved roads with streetlights and other cars, and all the comforting signs of civilization. I look back at that experience 7 years later as the single most disturbing and horrifying experience of my life. I don't think anyone can truly understand the feeling of helplessness I felt being out there in the forest in the middle of nowhere at night, stalked by some person who clearly wasn't right in the head. Maybe they'd set up home in that abandoned lodge, living like an animal in the ruins, emerging at night to hunt or scavenge or do whatever it is that people like that do. I don't know. I don't want to know. What I do know is that I've never gone back to those woods. I've never told anyone the full story of what happened that night. Not my parents, not my friends, no one. Because I know what they would say. They would tell me I was imagining things, that I let my fear get the better of me, that there's a rational explanation for everything I experienced. But they weren't there. They didn't hear that sound from the lodge. They didn't see the door, closed and covered with scratches that hadn't been there before. They didn't feel their campfire, cold and dead, extinguished by hands that weren't their own. They didn't hear that laughter, following them through the darkness, getting closer and closer but never quite catching up. I know what I experienced, and I know that whoever was out there that night, they're probably still there now, waiting in that rotting lodge, scratching at the door, laughing softly to themselves in the dark. God help anyone who finds them. The dashboard clock read 6:47 a.m. when we pulled out of our driveway in Chicago. Mom had packed the SUV the night before, cramming every available space with coolers, duffel bags, and my little brother Danny's collection of handheld games. At 18, I should have been spending spring break in Florida with my classmates, but Mom had other plans. She'd been talking about escaping city life for months, scrolling through real estate listings late into the night, dreaming of somewhere quieter, somewhere we could afford more than our cramped two-bedroom apartment. "This will be good for us," she said, adjusting her rearview mirror as we merged onto I-94. Fresh air, no traffic, actual stars at night. Danny, 7 years old and already bored, kicked the back of my seat rhythmically. "How much longer?" 10 hours, I told him, watching his face crumple in the rear view. "But I brought your tablet, fully charged." The first stretch through Wisconsin passed quickly. I took over driving near Madison, giving Mom a chance to rest. She'd been working double shifts at the hospital for weeks to save up for this trip. The rental cabin wasn't cheap, even in the off-season, but she'd found what she called a real deal on some vacation rental site. Looking back, I should have wondered why it was so affordable. By the time we crossed into Minnesota, the landscape had transformed. Gone were the endless suburbs and strip malls. Instead, towering pines lined the highway, their branches still dusted with remnants of winter snow despite the calendar claiming it was mid-March. The towns grew smaller and farther apart. First came the medium-sized ones with their Walmarts and chain restaurants, then the small ones with single main streets, and finally, nothing but forest and the occasional gas station. Mom took over driving again near Duluth. The GPS led us off the main highway onto progressively smaller roads. Asphalt gave way to gravel, then to dirt barely wide enough for 2 cars to pass. The sun was setting by the time we turned onto the final road, if you could call it that. It was more of a path, really, carved through dense woodland with branches scraping against our windows. "Are you sure this is right?" I asked, gripping the door handle as we bounced over a particularly deep rut. "The listing said it was secluded," Mom replied, though I could hear the uncertainty creeping into her voice. "Just a little further." The cabin appeared suddenly, as if the forest had reluctantly parted to reveal it. In the dying light it looked almost picturesque, a modest wooden structure with a stone chimney, surrounded by towering evergreens. But as we pulled up and the headlights swept across the building, the romantic image faded. The wood siding was weathered gray, with gaps between some boards, the front porch sagged slightly, and several shingles were missing from the roof. "It has character," Mom said, forcing enthusiasm into her voice. We unloaded in near darkness, the temperature dropping rapidly now that the sun had set. The front door stuck, requiring several hard shoves before it groaned open. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust and old wood, with an underlying mustiness that suggested it hadn't been occupied in months. The furniture was sparse but functional, a worn couch facing a stone fireplace, a small dining table with mismatched chairs, and a kitchen that looked like it hadn't been updated since 1975. Danny immediately claimed the smaller of the 2 bedrooms, leaving me with the converted attic space accessible by a narrow staircase. The ceiling sloped dramatically, and I had to duck to avoid the exposed beams, but it had a small window overlooking the forest and felt separate from the rest of the cabin, a feature I appreciated after sharing close quarters with my family for 10 hours. Mom busied herself with making the place habitable, wiping down surfaces and checking that the water and electricity worked. Everything functioned more or less, though the lights flickered occasionally and the water ran brown for the first minute. We ate sandwiches for dinner, too exhausted to attempt cooking, and by 8:30 Mom and Danny had retreated to their rooms. I tried to sleep but found myself wide awake, my body still vibrating from the long drive. The cabin sounds were foreign to my city-trained ears. Wood settled and creaked. Wind whistled through gaps in the walls. Somewhere in the distance an owl called, its voice eerily human-like. After an hour of tossing and turning, I gave up and descended to the living room. The fireplace drew me first. A neat stack of split logs sat beside it, and after a few attempts with matches from the kitchen, I managed to get a decent fire going. The warmth was welcome. The cabin's heating system consisted of ancient baseboard units that clicked and pinged but produced minimal heat. I settled onto the couch with my phone, but the lack of cell service made it useless for anything but downloaded content. Restlessness drove me to explore. The back door opened onto a small deck that I hadn't noticed in the darkness of our arrival. Wooden stairs descended to a clearing where someone had arranged several weather-beaten Adirondack chairs around a crude fire pit. Really just a ring of blackened stones. Beyond that, the forest pressed in on all sides, a wall of darkness that seemed almost solid. The silence out here was profound. In Chicago there was always noise. Sirens, traffic, neighbors, the hum of the city that never fully stopped. Here the quiet had weight, broken only by the whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant crack of branches. I found it simultaneously peaceful and unnerving. The night was colder than I'd anticipated. Minnesota in March was still winter in all but name, and my breath formed clouds in the air. The woodpile I'd spotted earlier extended along the side of the cabin, covered by a deteriorating tarp. I gathered an armful of the driest pieces and returned to the fire pit. Building the outdoor fire took more effort than the indoor one. The wood was slightly damp, and the wind kept scattering my attempts. But eventually, orange flames licked upward, casting a circle of warm light that made the surrounding darkness seem even deeper. I dragged one of the chairs closer and sat, mesmerized by the fire's dance. Time passed strangely out there. Minutes might have been hours. The fire crackled and hissed, occasionally sending up showers of sparks that died before reaching the tree branches overhead. I fed it steadily, watching the logs collapse into glowing coals. This was what Mom wanted for us, this peace, this connection to something simpler. I could almost understand it. The sound, when it came, was so sudden and out of place that my body reacted before my mind could process it. A sharp, percussive crack echoed from somewhere in the forest. Not the natural sound of a falling branch or an animal moving through underbrush, but something deliberate, metallic, like an axe biting into wood. I stayed frozen in my chair, ears straining. The fire suddenly seemed too bright, making me visible to anyone in the darkness beyond its reach. Logic told me it was probably nothing, maybe another cabin nearby, someone splitting wood for their own fire. But something about the sound's timing, its singular nature, made that explanation feel hollow. 5 minutes passed. 10. The forest had returned to its previous quiet, but now the silence felt different, expectant. The comfortable peace I'd found was gone, replaced by a crawling sensation along my spine. Every shadow beyond the firelight could hide watching eyes. Every whisper of wind could mask approaching footsteps. I stood abruptly. Decision made. Using dirt and gravel from around the pit, I smothered the fire, working quickly but thoroughly. The darkness rushed in as the last flames died, and I had to wait for my eyes to adjust before navigating back to the deck. The cabin's back door had never looked so welcoming. Inside, the living room felt safer, but not entirely secure. The windows, which during daytime would offer pleasant forest views, now seemed like vulnerabilities. Dark rectangles that revealed nothing while potentially displaying everything within to outside observers. I found myself avoiding passing directly in front of them. Mom's snoring drifted faintly from her room. Danny's door was cracked, his nightlight casting a thin strip of light into the hallway. Normal, peaceful sounds that should have been reassuring, but somehow emphasized my isolation. I settled back onto the couch, pulling up a downloaded movie on my phone. Something mindless and familiar to push away the lingering unease. 15 minutes into the movie, a sound made me pause. Not from outside this time, but from within the cabin. A creak prolonged and deliberate, like weight slowly applied to old wood. I held my breath, listening. These old buildings made noise. I knew that. Settling foundations, contracting materials, the normal sounds of an aging structure. But knowing and believing were different things at 11:30 at night in an unfamiliar place. The sound repeated, this time from the opposite end of the cabin, near the kitchen, where no bedrooms were located, where no one should be moving around. I set down my phone, muscles tensing. The window beside me faced that direction. I leaned closer, cupping my hands around my eyes to block the interior light's reflection. Nothing but darkness and my own pale face staring back. I was about to pull away when the knocks began. The sound was unmistakable. 3 heavy blows against the front door, deliberate and forceful. The impacts reverberated through the cabin's wooden frame, seeming to shake the very walls. My body went rigid, mind racing through possibilities. Who would be here? Why now? The nearest neighbor had to be miles away. What was that? Mom's voice, sharp with alarm, called from the hallway. She appeared moments later, hair disheveled, clutching her phone. Someone's at the door, I managed, though my throat felt constricted. Her face went pale. We both understood the wrongness of this. The isolation, the hour, the force behind those knocks. Without another word, she retreated to her room, and I could hear her speaking urgently, presumably to 911. I approached the door slowly, fighting every instinct that screamed at me to run. The peephole was positioned higher than standard, requiring me to stand on my toes. What I saw through that tiny lens made my stomach drop. A man stood on the porch, close enough that I could only see his torso and arms. One hand hung at his side, gripping something long and wooden. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness beyond the door, the object's shape became clear. An axe. Heavy-headed and worn, like something from a hardware store's bargain bin, or a tool shed, or a forest where someone had been chopping wood after dark. I stumbled backward, heart hammering. This was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. People didn't show up at remote cabins in the middle of the night carrying axes unless... The knocks came again, harder this time. 4 blows that seemed to test the door's strength. Still, the man didn't speak. Didn't call out a greeting or explanation. Just stood there, patient and silent, like he had all the time in the world. "Police are on the way," Mom whispered, appearing beside me. "They said to stay away from the doors and windows." Danny's voice, small and frightened, called from his room. Mom hurried to him while I remained frozen, staring at the door. The man was still there. I could see his shadow through the gap at the bottom, waiting for what? The next series of knocks answered that question. Not knocks anymore, but impacts. The door shuddered in its frame. On the 3rd blow, I heard wood splinter. "Get Danny," I shouted, my paralysis breaking. The bedroom at the back. Mom didn't need to be told twice. She scooped Danny up, blanket and all, and we ran for her bedroom, the farthest point from the front door. I slammed the door behind us, turning the flimsy lock that wouldn't stop anyone truly determined. Mom pushed the dresser in front of it while I grabbed the desk chair and wedged it under the doorknob. Another impact echoed through the cabin. The sound was different now. Not just knocking, but penetration. He was chopping through the door. Each blow was measured, methodical. He wasn't in a frenzy. This was calculated. Danny was crying, face buried in Mom's shoulder. She held him tight, phone pressed to her ear, updating the dispatcher in a voice that trembled but didn't break. I pressed my ear to the bedroom door, trying to track the intruder's progress. 4 more swings. 5. Then, nothing. The silence was almost worse than the violence. Had he broken through? Was he inside, moving carefully through the cabin? Or had he given up, melted back into the forest as mysteriously as he'd appeared? We huddled together on the bed, afraid to move, afraid to make any sound that might draw attention. "Police are close," Mom whispered. 10 minutes, maybe less. 10 minutes. It might as well have been hours. Every small sound, the settling of wood, the whisper of wind, made us tense. I kept expecting the bedroom door to explode inward, to see that axe bite through the wood like it had the front door. But nothing came. After what felt like an eternity, flashing lights painted red and blue patterns on the bedroom wall. A voice called out, identifying himself as law enforcement. Only then did Mom unlock the door, though she kept Danny and me behind her as she peered into the hallway. The damage was worse than I'd imagined. The front door bore 4 deep gashes, each one penetrating completely through in places. Wood chips littered the porch and entryway, but the door itself still stood, its deadbolt intact. The intruder had been moments away from breaking through when he'd stopped. 2 officers searched the immediate area, while a 3rd took our statements. They found footprints in the soft earth around the cabin, leading to and from the forest. No other trace. The senior officer, a weathered man who looked like he'd seen plenty in his years, had a theory. "Fire probably drew him," he said, nodding toward the back deck. "Someone living rough in the woods sees smoke and light where there shouldn't be any. Decides to investigate. With an axe?" Mom's voice was steel. "At midnight?" The officer shrugged. "Could be mental illness. Could be drugs. Could be someone who doesn't like outsiders in their territory. We get a few of these types, living off-grid in the national forest. Usually harmless, but sometimes," he gestured at the ruined door. They couldn't tell us much more. Without catching the man, there was no way to know his intentions. The younger officer helped us move the couch in front of the door as a temporary barricade, and promised increased patrols through the night. Small comfort when the nearest patrol car was stationed 30 minutes away. We spent the rest of the night in Mom's room, taking turns staying awake. I sat by the window, watching the tree line for any sign of movement. Every shadow could be him, returning to finish what he'd started. Mom called the rental company, demanding to be relocated immediately. They offered apologies and refunds, but no alternative accommodations at this hour. As dawn broke, painting the forest in shades of gray and gold, the terror of the night felt almost dreamlike, but the splintered door remained as evidence. We packed in record time, loading the SUV as the morning mist still clung to the ground. Danny never let go of Mom's hand, eyes constantly darting to the trees. The drive out felt longer than the drive in. Every bend in the narrow road could hide an ambush. Every gap in the trees might reveal a watching figure. It wasn't until we reached the main highway that I felt my shoulders relax. Mom found a motel 2 hours south, part of a familiar chain with security cameras and a front desk staffed 24/7. The normalcy was jarring. Families eating continental breakfast, kids splashing in the pool, a television playing morning news. Our night of terror wasn't even a story here. We never made it to those small Minnesota towns Mom wanted to explore. The real estate listings she'd bookmarked remained unviewed. The dream of rural life had curdled into nightmare in a single night. Instead, we drove straight through, taking turns behind the wheel, not stopping until the Chicago skyline appeared on the horizon. In the weeks that followed, I found myself researching, looking for similar incidents, trying to understand what had happened. I discovered that the area where we'd stayed had a history. Vagrants and hermits who'd made the deep forest their home, suspicious of outsiders, protective of what they saw as their territory. Some harmless eccentrics, others, not so much. The rental company removed the cabin listing. Whether from our complaint or others, I never learned. Sometimes I wonder if the man with the axe returned to find the cabin empty again, reclaiming what he saw as his, or maybe he moved on to the next isolated rental, the next family seeking peace in the wilderness. Mom doesn't talk about moving anymore. Our apartment, with its thin walls and constant noise, no longer seems like something to escape. The neighbors we once found annoying now provide comfort. The sirens that wake us at night are reminders of how quickly help can arrive. The city's chaos is still chaos, but it's a familiar chaos, one where men with axes don't materialize from dark forests. Danny still has nightmares sometimes. He crawls into Mom's bed, whispering about the bad man at the door. She holds him close, promising safety, though I suspect she has her own nightmares. I know I do. Not every night, but often enough. Dreams where I'm back on that deck, feeding the fire, and I hear that first sound again. Only in the dreams I don't go inside. I sit there paralyzed, as footsteps grow closer. We were lucky. I know that. The door held just long enough. The police arrived just fast enough. The intruder, for whatever reason, gave up just soon enough. A few variables changed, and this story ends differently. Ends with me not here to tell it. But I am here, and this is what happened during our spring break when I was 18. When we drove north seeking peace and found something else entirely. When we learned that some silences hide more than city noise ever could. When we discovered that sometimes the scariest monsters are just men with axes and unknown intentions, emerging from the darkness because they saw a fire where no fire should be. We don't take vacations to remote places anymore. The year was 1986, and I was 32 years old, working as a park ranger in the Blue Ridge Mountains. My name's Arlo Breckman, and I'd been on the job long enough to know when something just didn't feel right. I used to joke that my line of work required two things: a good pair of boots and a very short memory for anything that didn't make sense. It's not that I like to forget the strange things, more that the strange things like to forget me, or so I told myself. I'm not some macho gun-toting survivalist or anything like that, but you grow up in these parts, you learn a thing or two about how to handle the wild. My granddad taught me how to track, how to hunt, and most importantly, how to disappear when the world around you turns wrong. I never imagined I'd need that last bit of advice. Well, I did, and I wasn't ready. It was early in the day, around 7 a.m., when I got a call from a couple of hikers. Real yuppie types from the city, sounding shaken and out of breath. They said they'd found something weird about 6 miles up Trail 15. Now, weird is a relative term in these mountains. I've seen bear cubs playing with old car tires, deer with bizarre antler formations, and even the occasional lost hiker who swore up and down they'd seen Bigfoot. But something in their voices made my skin crawl. It wasn't just fear, it was confusion. That unsettling feeling when your brain can't quite process what your eyes are seeing. "What kind of weird are we talking about?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm and professional. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, it's a deer. But not all of it. Just half. I felt my stomach drop. "Half a deer? What do you mean?" "Exactly what I said," the hiker replied, his voice trembling. "It's like someone took a giant knife and sliced it right down the middle. The back half, just lying there. No blood. Nothing." I took a deep breath, trying to process what I was hearing. In my years as a ranger, I'd seen plenty of animal carcasses, predator kills, hunting accidents, even the occasional lightning strike. But this was something new. "All right," I said, grabbing my gear. "I'm on my way. Stay where you are and don't touch anything." As I headed out, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was going to be more than just another day on the job. The mountains seemed to loom larger than usual, the shadows deeper and more menacing. I'd always felt at home in these woods, but today, for the first time in years, I felt like an intruder. The drive up to Trail 15 was uneventful, but my mind was racing. What could possibly cut a deer in half so cleanly? A bear attack would be messy, leaving behind clear signs of a struggle. A mountain lion might drag its prey, but again there would be blood, tracks. As I parked my truck and started up the trail, I found myself wishing I had brought a gun. Now, before you start asking why a ranger in the Blue Ridge Mountains wouldn't carry a firearm, it's simple. This isn't Alaska. Most of what we deal with is human stupidity. Campfires in the wrong places, illegal hunting, maybe the odd bear if they wander too far down the trail. Nothing ever made me feel like I'd need one, until that day. The hike up to the site was eerily quiet. No bird song, no rustling in the underbrush. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I tried to shake off the feeling of dread that was slowly creeping up my spine, focusing instead on the task at hand. After about an hour of hiking, I saw the 2 hikers up ahead. They were huddled together, looking pale and shaken. As I approached, they pointed wordlessly to a small clearing just off the trail. And that's when I saw it. The sight that would change everything I thought I knew about these mountains, about nature itself. The sight that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. Half a deer, the back half. Like someone or something had sliced it right down the middle. Clean. No blood trail. No drag marks. It was just lying there like it had dropped from the sky. The weird didn't even cover what I was seeing. It was impossible, unnatural, and yet there it was, right in front of me. The 2 hikers were still pale, looked ready to run at the slightest provocation. I waved them off, told them to go back to the trailhead. They didn't need to see what I was about to do. As they hurried away, I approached the carcass, my heart pounding in my chest. The deer was cold. That's what made me second-guess everything. If a predator had done it, the body would have been fresh, the blood still wet. But this thing looked like it had been carved up by some giant butcher and left there to freak someone out. I took out my radio and called it in. "Weird situation, Trail 15. Half a deer, no blood." I didn't bother mentioning the fact it looked surgically cut in half. I could already hear the jokes back at the station. The static crackled back at me, but there was no response. The signal didn't always reach up here. I made a mental note to check it again when I got back down, and for some dumb reason I decided to stick around a bit longer. Call it morbid curiosity, or maybe just arrogance. I wanted to figure out what could do that to an animal and leave no trace. As I stood there, staring at the impossible sight before me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The forest, which had always been my second home, suddenly felt alien and hostile. Something had changed in these mountains, and I had a sinking feeling that this was only the beginning. Little did I know, as I stood there in that clearing, that my life was about to take a turn into realms of horror I never could have imagined. The mountains had secrets, dark and terrible secrets, and I was about to uncover them all. An hour passed as I scanned the area, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But nothing added up. No tracks, no sign of a struggle. It was as if the deer had simply materialized there, already bisected. The precision of the cut was what disturbed me the most. It wasn't jagged or torn like you'd expect from an animal attack. It was clean, almost surgical. I found myself wishing for my granddad's advice. He'd always had a way of making sense of the inexplicable, of finding reason in the chaos of nature. But he was long gone, and I was on my own. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting dappled shadows through the canopy, I decided to expand my search. Maybe there was something I was missing, some clue that would make this all make sense. I walked further along the trail, my senses on high alert for anything out of the ordinary. That's when I found it. About a mile off trail, down in a ravine. What I saw made me wish I hadn't looked at all. It was the rest of the deer. Well, parts of it. Scattered bones, fur, and sinew. All arranged like some messed up jigsaw puzzle. It was like something had ripped it apart, and then just stopped carrying halfway through. The bones were polished clean, as if they'd been bleaching in the sun for weeks, but the flesh was still pink and fresh. The stench hit me then, a sickly sweet odor that made my stomach churn. It wasn't the normal smell of decay you'd expect from a dead animal. This was something else, something chemical and wrong. As I stood there trying to process what I was looking at, I heard something. Footsteps. At first I thought it was another hiker. Maybe someone had followed me out here hoping for an explanation, but when I turned, there was no one. Just the sound of something large, heavy, circling me in the woods. My heart picked up speed and I instinctively crouched, scanning the tree line. Years of training kicked in, and I found myself automatically cataloging every sound, every movement in the undergrowth. Something was out there watching me. I could feel its gaze like a physical weight on my skin. That's when I saw it. If you've ever seen a wolf up close, you know they move with a kind of grace, like the forest itself bends around them. But this thing? It was too big. Way too big to be a wolf. It had that same lean muscle and long legs, but its back was arched in a way that made it look wrong, like someone had stretched it out too far, and its skin hadn't quite kept up. Its fur was matted, dark with what I hoped was mud, and its head, it reminded me of a coyote, but broader, with jaws that hung a little too loose, like they didn't fit the skull properly. As it moved through the underbrush, I could hear its joints creaking, an unnatural sound that sent shivers down my spine. I froze, calculating my odds. It hadn't seen me yet, or if it had, it didn't care. It sniffed the air, moving slowly, almost lazily, through the brush. Its long claws scraped the earth with each step, leaving deep furrows in the soft forest floor. Now here's where most folks would run, right? Or maybe climb a tree, get some height. Not me. Nope. I stood still, staring at this thing, wondering how I'd explain this to anyone if I got out alive. It was real, and it was hunting. I don't remember deciding to move, but I did. Slowly, real slow, like when you're trying to sneak out of your house as a kid without waking your parents. Step by step, I backed away, keeping my eyes on it the whole time. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure the creature could hear it. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, but I knew that would be a death sentence. Whatever this thing was, it was built for the chase. It was only when I stepped on a branch that the thing finally looked up. And when it did, I swear its jaw stretched even wider like it was smiling at me. Have you ever seen a predator lock onto something? There's a moment where the game changes, where they stop wandering around and fix on a target. That's what happened then. Its eyes. Well, let's just say it didn't need to look at me long to make its decision. They were a sickly yellow, with pupils that seemed to expand and contract independently of each other. There was an intelligence there, something cold and calculating, that had no place in an animal's gaze. I turned and ran. Let me tell you, the human body isn't designed to run at full speed through the woods. I was tripping over roots, dodging branches, and trying not to think about how fast it was gaining on me. Every time I glanced back, it was closer, bounding between trees with an unnatural grace that shouldn't belong to anything on this planet. The forest blurred around me as I ran, my lungs burning with each desperate breath. I could hear it behind me, its heavy breathing and the sound of branches snapping under its weight. It was toying with me, I realized. It could have caught me at any time, but it was enjoying the chase. I thought I was done for. Thought maybe my granddad's advice about disappearing wasn't going to help me here. The trees seemed to close in around me, branches clawing at my clothes, roots reaching up to trip me. It was as if the entire forest had turned against me, working with the creature to bring me down. But then, just as I broke through the tree line into a clearing, something unexpected happened. A gunshot rang out, echoing through the mountains. I hadn't heard anyone approach, but there he was, an older man, weathered and lean, with eyes that spoke of years spent in these woods. He fired another shot, this time aiming right at the creature's head. It howled, a sound that was part pain, part rage, and wholly inhuman. The beast staggered but didn't fall. Instead, it lunged at him with a speed I hadn't seen before. 1 minute the guy was standing, the next he was on the ground, screaming. His gun knocked clear out of his hands. I didn't think. I just reacted. Grabbed the rifle, aimed, and fired. Twice. Center mass, just like I'd been taught. The thing let out this, well, it wasn't a sound I ever want to hear again. It was like a scream and a roar mixed together, with something else underneath, something almost human. It collapsed, twitching, but not dead. Not yet. I watched as its chest rose and fell, like it was clinging to life with every bit of willpower it had. Then, with a final gasp, it stopped moving. The old man groaned, sitting up slowly, clutching at a deep wound on his shoulder. "You saved my life," he muttered, spitting out blood and dirt as if it were a casual conversation. I dropped the gun, my hands shaking uncontrollably. "What the hell was that thing?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I really wanted to know. He glanced at me, squinting through the pain. "Been around these woods for longer than anyone cares to admit," he said. "But folks like you don't know what lives here. You don't want to know." I stared at the creature's body, still twitching occasionally in the dirt. Part of me wanted to believe it was over, that the thing was dead. But another part of me, the part that had grown up listening to all the old stories, knew better. The mountain had its own rules. I'd just seen a few of them broken. As we stood there, catching our breath and trying to process what had just happened, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Something had awakened in these mountains. Something old and terrible. And I had a sinking feeling that I was going to be right in the middle of it all. We dragged the body out to the clearing, and I radioed in the incident. This time the signal got through. When they finally arrived, the rest of the team looked pale, like they'd never seen anything like it before. I knew the story we'd come up with wouldn't make sense to them. We were going to call it a freak animal attack. Hell, maybe that's what it was. I didn't care anymore. I just wanted to get back to some semblance of normal. As we waited for the authorities to arrive, the old man introduced himself as Hank. He didn't give a last name, and I didn't ask. There was something about him that suggested he'd been expecting something like this to happen for a long time. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked, wincing as he tried to stem the bleeding from his shoulder. I shook my head. "Moved here about 10 years ago. Thought I knew these mountains pretty well by now." Hank let out a dry chuckle that turned into a cough. 10 years. That's nothing. These mountains have been here for millions of years. They've got secrets you couldn't even begin to imagine. I wanted to ask him more, to understand what he meant, but that's when the first of the police cars arrived, sirens wailing. What followed was a blur of questions, statements, and barely concealed disbelief. I stuck to the story we'd agreed on. A large unidentified animal had attacked us. We'd managed to kill it in self-defense. The creature's body was loaded into a truck, destined for some lab where they'd try to make sense of it. As I watched them zip it into a body bag, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were making a mistake. That thing didn't belong in a lab. It didn't belong anywhere. Before I left, Hank looked at me and said something I still don't quite understand. "They're not all like that one. Some are worse and they don't come alone." I wanted to ask him what he meant, but he was already being led away by paramedics. As they loaded him into an ambulance, our eyes met one last time. There was a warning there, a plea for me to be careful. Then the doors closed, and he was gone. The next few days were a whirlwind of reports, debriefings, and thinly veiled skepticism from my superiors. Nobody wanted to believe what had happened. It was easier to write it off as an encounter with a rabid bear or some other explainable phenomenon. But I knew what I'd seen, and no amount of rationalization could erase the memory of that creature's impossible anatomy, its unnatural movements. I'd like to say I never went back to those woods, but life's never that simple. We're called, and I went. And though I never saw anything like that again, I always had this sinking feeling that the mountains were watching, waiting for the right moment to remind me just how small I was in the grand scheme of things. A week later, when I finally told my granddad what happened, he just laughed and said, "Told you to always disappear when things turn wrong. Guess you've got more learning to do." I suppose we all do. His casual response unnerved me more than the incident itself. It was as if he'd been expecting something like this to happen all along. I pressed him for more information, but he just shook his head and changed the subject. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was so much more to these mountains than I'd ever realized. The days that followed were filled with a strange, lingering dread. Every rustle in the bushes, every shadow that seemed a little too dark made my heart race. I found myself jumping at the slightest sounds, my hand instinctively reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. The forest, once my sanctuary, had become a place of potential danger. My colleagues noticed the change in me. They chalked it up to post-traumatic stress from the bear attack, as they were now calling it. I didn't bother correcting them. How could I explain what I'd seen without sounding completely insane? But it wasn't just the memory of the creature that haunted me. It was Hank's words. "They're not all like that one. Some are worse, and they don't come alone." The implication that there were more of these things out there, possibly even worse than what I'd encountered, kept me up at night. I threw myself into research, spending hours poring over local legends and folklore. I found stories of strange creatures in these mountains dating back centuries. Native American tales of shapeshifters and forest spirits, settler accounts of unexplained disappearances and eerie sounds in the night. Most people dismiss these as campfire stories, or the product of overactive imaginations, but now I wasn't so sure. One story in particular caught my attention. It was an old Cherokee legend about a race of beings that lived deep in the mountains. They were said to be ancient, predating even the oldest human settlements in the area. The legend described them as shapeshifters, able to take on the form of animals or even mimic human appearance. But their true form was something monstrous, beyond human comprehension. The more I read, the more I became convinced that what I'd encountered was just the tip of the iceberg. There was something out there, something old and dangerous, and it was waking up. About a month after the incident, I was assigned to lead a search and rescue operation. A group of college students had gone missing during a camping trip in a remote area of the park. As I geared up for the mission, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had been my constant companion since that day in the clearing. The search area was deep in the heart of the mountains, in a section of the park that saw little human traffic. As we hiked in, I noticed the same eerie silence that had preceded my encounter with the creature. No bird song, no rustling in the underbrush, just the sound of our own breathing and the crunch of leaves under our boots. We split into teams, each taking a different section of the search grid. I found myself paired with a young ranger named Tom. He was new to the job, full of enthusiasm and blissfully unaware of the true nature of these mountains. As we pushed deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to close in around us. The canopy overhead grew thicker, blocking out most of the sunlight. An unnatural fog began to roll in, reducing visibility to mere feet in front of us. "This isn't right," Tom muttered, his earlier confidence evaporating. "The weather report didn't say anything about fog." I nodded, my hand instinctively moving to the rifle slung across my back. "Stay close," I warned him. "It's easy to get turned around in conditions like this." We pressed on, calling out for the missing students and listening for any response. But the fog seemed to swallow our voices, muffling them to barely more than a whisper. That's when I saw it, a flash of movement in the corner of my eye. I spun around, rifle at the ready, but there was nothing there, just more fog and shadows. "Did you see that?" I asked Tom, my voice tight with tension. He shook his head, eyes wide with fear. "See what?" I didn't see anything. I was about to respond when we heard it. A scream, distant but unmistakable, echoing through the fog-shrouded forest. It was a sound of pure terror, cut off abruptly in a way that made my blood run cold. Tom and I exchanged a glance, then took off running in the direction of the scream. The fog parted before us, then closed in behind, as if it were herding us towards something. I had a sinking feeling in my gut that we were being led into a trap, But what choice did we have? Someone was in danger, and it was our job to help. We burst into a small clearing, and what I saw there will haunt me for the rest of my days. The missing students were there, or what was left of them. Their bodies were arranged in a grotesque circle, limbs twisted at impossible angles. In the center of the circle stood a figure that defied description. It was tall, easily 7 feet, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its skin was a mottled gray, covered in what looked like scales or plates. But it was its face, or lack thereof, that truly terrified me. Where a face should have been, there was only a smooth, featureless expanse of skin. As we stood there frozen in horror, the thing's head swiveled towards us. Though it had no eyes that I could see, I felt its gaze lock onto me. In that moment I knew with absolute certainty that this was what Hank had warned me about. This was something far worse than what I'd encountered before. Tom let out a strangled cry beside me, snapping me out of my paralysis. I raised my rifle, but before I could fire, the creature moved. It was impossibly fast, crossing the clearing in the blink of an eye. One moment it was standing in the center of its grisly tableau, the next it was right in front of us. I fired, the sound of the shot deafening in the enclosed space. The creature staggered back, black ichor oozing from a wound in its chest. But it didn't fall. Instead, it let out a sound that was part screech, part roar, a noise that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Run," I yelled at Tom, pushing him towards the edge of the clearing. We took off, crashing through the underbrush, the sound of the creature's pursuit right behind us. The fog closed in, thicker than ever, until I could barely see Tom running beside me. As we ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't escaping. We were being herded, driven towards something. The forest around us seemed to shift and change, trees moving of their own accord to block our path. Suddenly, Tom's scream pierced the air. I turned to see him being dragged backwards into the fog, his fingers clawing desperately at the ground. I reached for him, but it was too late. He vanished into the mist, his scream cut off as suddenly as it had begun. I was alone now, lost in a forest that no longer made sense. The creature's roar echoed around me, seeming to come from every direction at once. I ran blindly, my lungs burning, my legs aching. I no longer knew if I was heading towards safety or deeper into danger. As I burst through a thick patch of undergrowth, I found myself on the edge of a cliff. The fog cleared for a moment, revealing a drop of hundreds of feet to the jagged rocks below. I skidded to a stop, nearly losing my balance. I turned, rifle raised, ready to make my last stand. The creature emerged from the fog, its featureless face somehow radiating malevolence. It advanced slowly, almost lazily, knowing it had me trapped. In that moment, my granddad's words came back to me. Always disappear when things turn wrong. I looked at the cliff edge behind me, then back at the approaching monster. I made my choice. I jumped. As I fell, I heard the creature's roar of frustration. The world spun around me, the cliff face rushing past in a blur. I closed my eyes, waiting for the impact that would end it all. But it never came. Instead of the bone-shattering impact I expected, I felt myself plunging into icy water. The shock of it drove the air from my lungs, and for a moment I was sure I was going to drown. But survival instinct kicked in, and I clawed my way to the surface, gasping for air. As I treaded water, trying to get my bearings, I realized I had fallen into an underground river. The current was swift, carrying me deeper into the mountain. Above me, I could see the narrow sliver of sky through the crevice I had fallen through, rapidly receding as the river bore me along. The roar of the creature echoed faintly, growing more distant by the second. For the moment, at least, I had escaped. But I was far from safe. The underground river twisted and turned, sometimes narrowing to the point where I had to duck to avoid smashing my head on low-hanging rock formations. Other times it opened into vast caverns, their ceilings lost in darkness. The water was bitingly cold, and I knew that hypothermia would become a real danger if I didn't find a way out soon. I'm not sure how long I was carried along by the current. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the darkness, but eventually the river slowed, and I found myself in a large, dimly lit cavern. Phosphorescent fungi clung to the walls, casting an eerie blue-green glow over everything. With the last of my strength, I managed to swim to a rocky shore and drag myself out of the water. I lay there for a long time, shivering uncontrollably, too exhausted to move. As feeling slowly returned to my numbed limbs, I took stock of my situation. My rifle was gone, lost in the river. My radio, if it had survived the fall, would be useless this far underground. I was soaked to the bone, bruised, and utterly lost. But I was alive, which was more than I had expected when I jumped off that cliff. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I began to notice details about the cavern that made my blood run cold. The rock formations weren't entirely natural. Some had been shaped, carved into strange, twisting forms that hurt my eyes to look at directly, and there were markings on the walls, symbols in a language I didn't recognize, glowing faintly with the same phosphorescence as the fungi. I forced myself to my feet, wincing at the pain in my battered body. I needed to find a way out, or at least somewhere safer to rest and plan my next move. As I stumbled along the shore, I noticed that the carvings became more frequent, more elaborate. They seemed to be telling a story, though it was one I couldn't begin to decipher. That's when I saw the structure. At first, I thought it was just another rock formation, but as I got closer, I realized it was artificial. It was a building of some kind, its architecture unlike anything I had ever seen. The angles were all wrong, seeming to bend in ways that shouldn't be possible. It was as if whoever, or whatever, had built it had a completely different understanding of geometry. I approached cautiously, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but I knew I couldn't survive long in this underground world without shelter and supplies. If this structure had been built, maybe there was a way out. As I neared the entrance, I noticed something that made me pause. Footprints in the sandy soil, leading into the structure. They weren't human footprints. They were similar to the tracks I had seen in the forest, left by the creature that had chased me. But these were older, partially eroded by time. I stood there for a long moment, weighing my options. Go into the alien structure, possibly walking into the lair of more of those creatures, or stay out here, slowly freezing to death in my wet clothes. In the end, survival won out over caution. I stepped into the entrance, the wrongness of the angles making me dizzy. The interior was dimly lit by more of the phosphorescent fungi, revealing a large circular chamber. The walls were covered in more of those strange symbols, and in the center of the room stood a pedestal. On top of it was an object that defied description, a shifting, twisting thing that seemed to be simultaneously solid and liquid, organic and mechanical. As I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, I heard a sound behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. There, blocking the entrance, stood Hank. But it wasn't the Hank I had met in the forest. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were solid black, reflecting the eerie light of the cavern. "I told you they weren't all like that one," he said, his voice echoing strangely in the chamber. "Welcome, Arlo. We've been waiting for you for a very long time." As he spoke, I became aware of movement in the shadows around the edges of the chamber. More figures emerged, some human-like, others more akin to the creature I had encountered in the forest. All of them had those same terrible black eyes. I realized then that I hadn't escaped at all. I had walked right into their trap. And as Hank, or whatever was wearing Hank's form, advanced towards me, I understood with terrifying clarity that my journey into the heart of the mountain secrets was only just beginning. "What are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely above a whisper. The thing wearing Hank's face smiled, but it wasn't a human expression. It was more like a predator baring its teeth. "We are the old ones," it said, its voice resonating with an otherworldly timbre. "We have lived in these mountains since before your kind learned to walk upright. We have watched, we have waited, and now it is time for you to understand." The other figures moved closer, forming a circle around me. I could see now that they were a grotesque mixture of human and animal features, as if someone had tried to create life without fully understanding how the pieces should fit together. "You're not Hank," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What did you do to him?" The creature laughed, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Hank has been one of us for longer than you've been alive, boy. He was our eyes and ears in your world, and now you will take his place." Before I could react, two of the creatures grabbed my arms, their grip inhumanly strong. I struggled, but it was useless. They dragged me towards the pedestal in the center of the room. Look, Not Hank commanded, gesturing to the strange object on the pedestal. Look and understand. I didn't want to. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to close my eyes, to look away, but I couldn't. The object seemed to draw my gaze, pulling me in. As I stared, the shifting, twisting form began to take shape. I saw images, flashes of things that couldn't be real. I saw the mountains as they were millions of years ago, before humans walked the earth. I saw strange, otherworldly beings descending from the stars, making their home in the depths of the earth. I saw them watching as humanity grew and spread, always hiding, always waiting. And I saw their plan, a plan that had been in motion for millennia, a plan that was now approaching its final stages. They were going to reclaim the surface world, to reshape it in their image, and they needed humans to do it. Humans like me, transformed and molded into something new. The visions faded, and I found myself on my knees, gasping for breath. The creatures around me watched impassively, their black eyes unblinking. Do you understand now? Not Hank asked, its voice almost gentle. You are not the hunter here, Arlo. You never were. You're livestock, carefully bred and selected over generations. And now, you're ready for the next step. I thought of all the missing persons cases over the years, all the unexplained disappearances in these mountains. How many of them had ended up here, in this underground chamber? How many had been transformed into these monstrous hybrids? Why me? I managed to ask, my mind reeling from what I'd seen. Because you're special, Arlo, Not Hank said. You have a connection to these mountains that goes beyond mere biology. You can feel it, can't you? The pull, the sense that there's more to this place than meets the eye. That's why we chose you. I thought of my grandfather, of his cryptic warnings and his seemingly casual acceptance of the impossible. Had he known? Had he been preparing me for this all along? What if I refuse? I asked, already knowing the answer. Not Hank's smile widened, revealing rows of sharp needle-like teeth. You don't have a choice, boy. The process has already begun. From the moment you encountered our scout in the forest, you were marked. The transformation is inevitable. As if on cue, I felt a searing pain in my chest. I looked down to see my skin rippling, changing texture. I screamed, the sound echoing off the cavern walls. Embrace it, Arlo, Not Hank said, its voice fading as the pain overwhelmed me. Embrace your true nature. Become one with the mountain. As darkness closed in around me, I had one last desperate thought. I had to escape. I had to warn someone. But even as I thought it, I could feel my mind changing, twisting into something alien and unknowable. The last thing I saw before I lost consciousness was my own reflection in a pool of water on the cavern floor. My eyes, once brown, were now as black as the endless depths of the mountain itself. I don't know how long I was unconscious. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the depths of the mountain. When I finally came to, everything had changed. My senses were sharper, almost overwhelmingly so. I could hear the faintest drip of water echoing through distant tunnels, smell the ancient must of the cavern, and see in the near-total darkness as if it were twilight. But the most terrifying change was within my own mind. Memories that weren't my own flooded my consciousness. Centuries of watching, waiting, planning. I saw the rise and fall of civilizations through inhuman eyes, felt the patient hunger of beings so ancient they made mountains seem young. I tried to move and found my body responding in ways that were both familiar and alien. My limbs were longer, more sinuous. My skin had taken on a mottled grayish hue that seemed to shift and change in the dim light. I raised a hand to my face and felt smooth, featureless skin where my features should have been. The transformation is nearly complete, a voice said. I turned to see Not Hank watching me, its black eyes unreadable. How do you feel, Arlo? I opened my mouth to speak, but what came out was a series of clicks and whistles that somehow conveyed meaning. What have you done to me? I asked, though the words were not in any human language. We have elevated you, Not Hank replied. You are becoming one of us, a bridge between two worlds. Through you and others like you, we will reclaim what was once ours. As it spoke, I became aware of a vast, alien consciousness pressing against my mind. The old ones, countless in number, their thoughts and memories stretching back to the dawn of time. They were trying to subsume me, to erase what was left of my human identity. I fought back, clinging desperately to my memories of who I was. Arlo Breckman, park ranger, protector of these mountains. I thought of my grandfather, of his warnings and lessons. Always disappear when things turn wrong, he had said. But how could I disappear from my own transformed body? The struggle must have shown on my altered face, because Not Hank stepped closer, its expression almost sympathetic. Don't fight it, Arlo. Embrace your new nature. You will be more than you ever were as a mere human. But as it spoke, something clicked in my mind. A memory, not fully erased by the transformation. The cliff, the underground river. I had escaped once. Maybe I could do it again. With a strength I didn't know I possessed. I lunged at Not Hank, catching it off guard. We tumbled to the ground, a tangle of limbs both human and inhuman. The other creatures in the chamber let out shrieks of surprise and anger, converging on us. But in that moment of chaos, I saw my chance. The entrance to the chamber was unguarded. Using my new altered body, I sprang to my feet and ran, faster than I had ever moved before. I crashed through tunnels, my enhanced senses guiding me through the labyrinthine passages. Behind me, I could hear the pursuit, the enraged cries of the old ones echoing off the stone walls. I ran for what felt like hours, twisting and turning through the mountain's depths. My new body didn't tire, didn't need to pause for breath, but I could feel the alien consciousness pressing harder against my mind, trying to take control. Just when I thought I couldn't resist any longer, I saw a glimmer of light ahead, a crack in the rock face, barely wide enough for a human to squeeze through. With the last of my willpower, I forced my transformed body through the opening, feeling my skin tear and heal almost instantly. I emerged onto a narrow ledge, high up on the mountainside. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The beauty of it nearly overwhelmed my altered senses. But I couldn't stop. I could still feel them behind me, their alien minds reaching out, trying to reclaim me. I began to climb, using my new abilities to scale sheer rock faces that would have been impossible for a human. As I climbed higher, I felt the old one's influence beginning to fade. The higher I got, the more human I felt. By the time I reached the summit, my body had almost returned to its original form. Almost, but not quite. My skin still shimmered with an otherworldly sheen, and when I caught my reflection in a pool of rainwater, I saw that my eyes remained solid black. Standing there, on top of the mountain I had once thought I knew so well, I realized that my life had changed forever. I couldn't go back to who I was, couldn't pretend that the world was as simple and straightforward as I had once believed. But I was still me, still Arlo Breckman, and I had a duty to protect these mountains and the people who lived in their shadow. Not from bears or lost hikers, but from the ancient horrors that dwelled in the depths. As the last light of day faded, I began my descent, my mind racing with plans. I had to find a way to warn people, to prepare them for what was coming. But who would believe me? How could I fight against being so ancient and powerful? I didn't have the answers yet, but I knew one thing for certain. The battle for the mountains had only just begun, and I was now on the front lines. The descent from the mountain peak was a blur of conflicting sensations. My body, not quite human but no longer fully transformed, moved with an unnatural grace through the treacherous terrain. As I made my way down, I grappled with the enormity of what I had experienced and the weight of the knowledge now burning in my mind. By the time I reached the forest proper, dawn was breaking. The familiar sounds of the waking woodland, birdsong, rustling leaves, the distant call of a deer, felt alien to my enhanced senses. Everything was sharper, more vibrant, and tinged with an awareness of hidden dangers lurking just beyond human perception. I knew I couldn't go back to my old life. How could I, with what I now knew? The Park Service, my colleagues, even my family, they were all oblivious to the ancient evil dwelling beneath their feet. And yet I couldn't simply disappear. I had a responsibility, not just as a park ranger, but as someone who had seen the truth. For days I stayed in the wilderness, avoiding human contact as I tried to come to terms with my new reality. I discovered that my transformation wasn't entirely reversible. While I could maintain a mostly human appearance, there were times, especially under stress or in the dark, when my features would shift, becoming more akin to the creatures I had encountered underground. More unsettling were the flashes of alien memory that would surface unexpectedly. Visions of star-filled skies unfamiliar to Earth, of civilizations rising and falling, of patient plans spanning millennia. It took all my willpower to keep these memories from overwhelming my sense of self. After a week, I knew I had to make a decision. I couldn't hide forever, and the longer I stayed away, the harder it would be to explain my absence. So, steeling myself, I made my way back to the ranger station. The reaction to my return was a mix of relief and suspicion. I spun a tale of getting lost after the bear attack, of wandering delirious through the wilderness until I found my way back. It was clear my colleagues didn't entirely believe me, but they were willing to accept the explanation rather than confront the impossible truth. As the weeks passed, I settled into a new routine. By day, I performed my ranger duties, ever watchful for signs of the Old One's influence. By night, I patrolled the hidden places of the mountains, using my new abilities to track and sometimes confront the creatures that ventured too close to human settlements. I began keeping a journal, documenting everything I could remember about the Old Ones, their plans, and the strange biology of their hybrids. I knew it was dangerous. If it fell into the wrong hands, it could expose everything. But I also knew that someone needed to know the truth if anything happened to me. Occasionally, I would encounter Hank, or rather the thing that had worn Hank's face. These encounters were tense standoffs, neither of us willing to risk open confrontation. It was clear the Old Ones still wanted me back, still saw me as a valuable asset in their plans. But they were patient. They had waited millennia. They could wait a little longer. As months turned into years, I found myself walking a precarious line between two worlds. I was no longer fully human, but neither was I one of them. I was a guardian of secrets most of humanity wasn't ready to face. A protector standing against forces beyond comprehension. There were times when the loneliness of my position threatened to overwhelm me. I couldn't form close relationships, couldn't risk anyone discovering what I had become. The only person who seemed to understand, even a little, was my grandfather. Though I never told him the full story, I think he knew more than he let on. His cryptic advice took on new meaning in light of what I had experienced. "The mountains have their own rules," he'd say, his eyes twinkling with a knowledge that went beyond mere folklore. "Best we learn to live by them." And so I did. I learned to use my transformed senses to protect both the unwitting humans who visited the park and the ancient secrets that lay hidden within the earth. I became a creature of two worlds, never fully belonging to either, but essential to both. As I stand here now, looking out over the misty peaks of the Blue Ridge, I know that my battle is far from over. The Old Ones are still there, deep below, patient and plotting. Their hybrids still roam the shadowy places of the world, and humanity remains blissfully unaware of the precipice on which it stands. But I'll be here watching, waiting, and protecting. For I am Arlo Breckman, no longer just a park ranger, but a guardian of the threshold between worlds. And as long as I draw breath, I'll ensure that the horrors of the depths never fully reclaim the world above. The mountains keep their secrets, and now, so do I. This is my purpose, my curse, and my gift. This is my new normal. I've worked as a park ranger in the Nicolet National Forest of northern Wisconsin for 17 years. And I'm writing this account because what happened last October needs to be documented before I lose my nerve entirely. My name doesn't matter, but what I witnessed does. I'm submitting this to the Park Service archives, though I doubt anyone will believe it. I'm not sure I would have believed it myself if someone had told me these things before I saw them with my own eyes. The trouble started when hikers stopped returning from the northwest quadrant of the forest. First, it was a solo backpacker named Matthew Hendricks who missed his checkout date. We found his campsite 3 days later, and what we discovered there still haunts my sleep. His tent had been shredded from the outside, massive claw marks tearing through the heavy canvas like it was tissue paper. His backpack was torn open, food scattered everywhere. But here's what made my blood run cold. There were tracks. Not bear tracks, though I've seen thousands of those in my career. These were canine, but impossibly large, each print nearly 10 inches long, with claw marks extending another 2 inches beyond the toe pads. What made them truly disturbing was that they transitioned mid-stride from four-legged to two-legged locomotion. Whatever made those tracks had stood up and walked away like a man. My supervisor, a grizzled veteran named Ezra Walsh, told me to keep quiet about the tracks. Probably just a large wolf and some distortion from melting snow, he said, but his eyes told me he didn't believe his own words. I could see the fear there, buried deep beneath years of practiced stoicism. We never found Matthew's body. 2 weeks later, a family of 4 went missing. The Coopers, Gabriel, his wife Sarah, and their 2 teenage sons, Isaac and Dylan, were experienced campers. When they didn't return, I led the search party myself, taking along 2 other rangers, Jaden Cruz and Luca Morrison. We found their camp in a small clearing beside Blackwater Creek, and the scene made Jaden vomit into the bushes. The family's tent was collapsed, torn apart from above as if something had reached down from an impossible height. Blood splattered the surrounding trees, some of it 15 feet up the trunks. We found Sarah Cooper's hiking boots 70 yards away, her foot still inside it, severed cleanly at the ankle. The tracks around the camp were enormous, humanoid footprints that measured 18 inches long and 7 inches wide, with a stride that no human could possibly match. The depth of the impression suggested something weighing at least 800 pounds. But it was the smell that truly terrified us. A putrid, decaying odor hung in the air, like rotting meat mixed with wet dog and something else I couldn't identify. Something ancient and wrong. Luca found tufts of dark reddish-brown hair caught on the bark of nearby trees, coarse hair that didn't match any animal we could identify. We bagged it as evidence, though I knew in my gut that no laboratory analysis would give us answers we wanted to hear. That night, back at the ranger station, Ezra pulled me aside. His hands were shaking as he poured himself a whiskey, something I'd never seen him do on duty. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't the first time." He told me about incidents from 30 years ago, before my time, when hikers reported seeing a massive bipedal canine creature stalking them through the trees. The reports described something 7 to 8 feet tall, covered in dark fur, with a wolf-like head but walking upright like a man. The eyes, witnesses said, glowed amber in the darkness, and held an intelligence that was distinctly malevolent. The Park Service had buried the reports, dismissing them as hoaxes or misidentifications, but Ezra had seen it once himself, watching him from a ridgeline at dusk. It wasn't curious, he said. It was hunting. I wanted to dismiss his story as the paranoid ramblings of a man shaken by tragedy, but I couldn't. Not after what I'd seen at those campsites. The search for the Coopers continued for 2 more days before something else happened that changed everything. A hiker named Thomas Rivera stumbled into the ranger station at 3 in the morning. Hypothermic and incoherent, his clothes were torn, his face scratched and bleeding from running through underbrush in the dark. When we finally got him calmed down and wrapped in blankets, the story he told made my skin crawl. Thomas and his friend Maverick Chen had been camping near Granite Peak when they heard something moving through the forest around midnight. At first they thought it was a bear, but the footsteps were wrong, too rhythmic, too purposeful. Then they smelled it, that same rotting odor I'd encountered at the Cooper campsite. Maverick shined his flashlight toward the sound, and Thomas said what they saw would be burned into his memory forever. Standing at the edge of the firelight was a creature that shouldn't exist. It stood at least 9 feet tall, covered in dark matted fur. The body was roughly humanoid but too thin, too stretched, with arms that hung down past its knees. The face was the worst part, gaunt and skeletal, with skin pulled tight over the bones, lips drawn back to reveal yellow teeth that were far too long and sharp. The eyes were sunken deep in the skull but gleamed with a predatory intelligence in the firelight. Thomas said the creature's stomach looked distended, and its breath came in ragged gasps as if it were starving despite its size. When Maverick screamed, the thing moved with horrifying speed, crossing the distance between them in 2 impossibly long strides. Thomas ran blindly into the forest, and didn't stop running until he reached the ranger station. We organized an emergency search party at first light, but when we reached their campsite, we found only Maverick's sleeping bag, soaked with blood, and deep gouges in the earth where something had been dragged away toward the deeper forest. I knew then what we were dealing with, though I didn't want to admit it. The Wendigo. Every culture in these northern forests has a name for it. The Ojibwe call it the Wendigo, the Cree call it the Wetiko, a spirit of insatiable hunger and winter cold, said to possess those who resort to cannibalism or simply manifest as a creature of pure predatory malice. I'd heard the stories from local tribal elders, dismissed them as folklore meant to discourage people from cannibalism during harsh winters. But folklore doesn't leave 18-inch footprints. Folklore doesn't tear people apart and drag them screaming into the darkness. Ezra made the call to close the northwest quadrant of the forest to all visitors, citing dangerous wildlife activity. But we both knew that wouldn't be enough. These things, whatever they were, had territory that stretched for miles, and they were hunting with increasing boldness. On the fifth night after the Coopers disappeared, I was alone at a remote fire tower, monitoring the forest for illegal campfires. The tower stood 80 feet above the canopy, and I felt relatively safe up there despite everything that had happened. That false sense of security vanished at 2 in the morning when I heard something climbing the metal scaffolding beneath me. The sound was methodical, hand over hand, rung after rung, but too fast, too confident. I grabbed my radio with shaking hands and clicked on my flashlight, pointing it down through the trapdoor. What I saw nearly stopped my heart. Climbing toward me was something that moved like a gorilla, but had the face of a wolf. Its eyes caught the light and reflected back a hellish amber glow. Saliva dripped from its jaws as it climbed, and I could see the muscles rippling beneath its fur. The thing was massive, easily 700 pounds, but it ascended the tower with ease. It paused 20 feet below me, tilted its head, and I heard something that made my blood freeze. A low rumbling sound that was almost like laughter. I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the emergency flare gun and fired it directly at the creature. The flare struck its shoulder, and the thing released a howl that didn't sound like any wolf or dog I'd ever heard. It was deeper, more resonant, almost human in its rage. It dropped from the tower and disappeared into the darkness, but I could hear it circling below, pacing back and forth, waiting. I radioed for help and spent the next 4 hours trapped in that tower, listening to the thing prowl beneath me. Sometimes it would shake the entire structure, testing its stability. Other times it would go silent, and those moments were worse because I knew it was still there, watching, planning. When dawn finally broke and a Park Service helicopter arrived with Ezra and a team of armed rangers, the creature was gone. But we found its tracks in the mud around the tower base, along with deep claw marks gouged into the metal support beams. That was the Dogman. I'm certain of it now. The creature has been reported in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota for over a century, always in remote forests, always hunting. And it wasn't alone. The following week, a logger named Elias Henderson reported finding massive footprints in fresh snow near the Canadian border just north of our park. He called them in because there were dozens of them, forming a trail that stretched for miles. I drove up with Josiah Martinez and Caleb Reed to investigate, and what we found convinced me that our forest was at the center of something far more terrifying than isolated attacks. The footprints were fresh, massive, and humanoid, but they weren't like the Wendigo tracks. These were broader, deeper, and spaced in a normal walking gait. Bigfoot tracks. I'd seen casts of alleged Sasquatch prints before, always dismissed them as hoaxes. These were real. We followed the trail for 3 miles into increasingly dense forest until we found something that made us stop dead. In a small ravine, we discovered what can only be described as a feeding ground. Deer carcasses, at least a dozen of them, had been piled against the rocks. They'd been torn apart with incredible force. Bones snapped like twigs, but stranger still were the signs of some kind of territorial marking. Trees had been twisted and broken at heights of 10 to 12 feet, creating a perimeter around the site. And in the center of it all, arranged with disturbing precision, were the scattered remains of human clothing. I recognized Gabriel Cooper's jacket. We were standing there, trying to process what we were seeing, when Josiah grabbed my arm and pointed up the ravine. Something was moving through the trees 50 yards away. It was enormous, at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark auburn hair. The creature moved with a fluid grace despite its size, navigating through the dense undergrowth without making a sound. Then it stopped, turned, and looked directly at us. I've never felt fear like that in my entire life. The creature's face was surprisingly human. Too human. It had a flat nose, a heavy brow, and dark eyes that radiated intelligence and something else, anger. We were in its territory, and it knew we'd seen what it had done. For a long moment, none of us moved. Then the creature released a vocalization that started as a low rumble and built into a deafening roar that echoed through the ravine. It was a warning. We ran. I don't remember much of the hike back to the truck, just the sound of our boots pounding the frozen ground and the occasional crack of branches behind us. The thing followed us for at least a mile, never attacking but making sure we knew it was there. When we finally reached the road, I looked back and saw it standing at the forest edge, watching us leave. That night, I sat in Ezra's office and laid everything out. 3 different cryptids, all active in the same forest, all hunting. The dogmen taking victims from their tents. The Wendigo stalking camps in the deep woods. And the Sasquatch marking territory and accumulating kills. This wasn't coincidence. Something had drawn them here, or perhaps they'd always been here, and we'd finally pushed too far into their domain. Ezra made a decision then that probably saved lives, though it cost him his career. He went to the press. He told them everything. The missing hikers, the tracks, what we'd seen. The Park Service suspended him immediately, called him unstable. But the story spread, and people stopped coming to the Northwest Quadrant. The federal government eventually closed that section of the forest indefinitely, citing environmental protection concerns. But I still work in these woods, and I know they're still out there. Sometimes, on quiet nights at the ranger station, I hear howls in the distance that don't match any wolf. Sometimes I find tracks that no known animal could have made. And sometimes when I'm alone in the forest at dusk, I feel eyes watching me from the shadows between the trees. I'm writing this because people need to know the truth. The American wilderness is not empty. There are things in these forests that have lived here far longer than we have. Things that were here before the first Europeans arrived. Things that the indigenous peoples learned to respect and fear. We've forgotten those lessons, pushed deeper into their territory with our hiking trails and campsites, and now we're paying the price. Matthew Hendricks, the Cooper family, Maverick Chen, they're all still missing, and I know we'll never find them. Whatever took them has taken them deep into territories we can't follow, places where human beings were never meant to go. The forest keeps its secrets, and some secrets are better left buried. But if you ever find yourself camping in northern Wisconsin, and you smell rotting meat on the wind, or you hear something large moving through the trees on 2 legs, or you see amber eyes reflecting your flashlight from the darkness, run. Don't try to document it. Don't try to be brave. Just run, and don't look back. Because in these woods, there are still monsters, and they're hungry. The highway stretched endlessly before me, asphalt ribbons cutting through dense forests that seemed to grow darker with each passing mile. It was late September 2016, and I was making a journey I'd put off for nearly 8 months since my father's funeral in January. The drive to his old cabin was supposed to take 6 hours, but I'd already been on the road for 7, having gotten lost twice on unmarked back roads that all looked identical in the fading afternoon light. My father rarely spoke about the cabin or the town where he'd grown up. Whenever I asked as a child, he'd get this distant look in his eyes and change the subject, redirecting the conversation to anything else. My schoolwork, upcoming baseball games, Mom's garden. It wasn't until I was packing up his belongings after the funeral that I found the deed to the property, tucked away in a lockbox beneath his workbench. The address was handwritten on yellowed paper, the ink faded but still legible. Something about holding that deed in my hands made me feel like I needed to see the place, to understand this part of him that had always remained hidden from me. The GPS on my phone had stopped working about 40 miles back, leaving me to navigate using an old paper map I'd found in my father's truck, the same truck I was now driving. I'd inherited it along with everything else, though there wasn't much. My father had lived simply, almost ascetically, in his later years. The sparse furnishings of his small apartment had shocked me. For a man who'd worked as a carpenter his entire life, he owned remarkably little. As I crested a hill, I finally saw it. What remained of Millfield, the town where my father had spent the first 30 years of his life. Calling it a ghost town would have been generous. It was more like a corpse of a town, picked clean by time and abandonment. A single main street ran through it, lined with hollow buildings that seemed to lean inward as if conspiring together in the gathering dusk. Windows gaped like empty eye sockets, doors hung at odd angles. Nature had begun the slow process of reclamation. Vines crawled up brick facades, tree roots buckled the cracked pavement, and weeds sprouted through every gap in the concrete. I slowed the truck to a crawl, driving down that desolate main street. There was a general store with a faded Coca-Cola sign still clinging to its front. A barber shop with a rusted pole that no longer turned. A diner with booths visible through broken windows. Their vinyl seats split in spilling foam like open wounds. Everything was gray and brown, colors leached away by decades of harsh weather and neglect. According to the map, I needed to park somewhere near the old gas station on the east end of town and hike 2 miles north into the woods. The trail wouldn't be marked, my father had told me that much years ago in one of his rare unguarded moments, but there were landmarks to follow. A lightning-struck oak, a creek crossing, a boulder shaped like a crouching bear. I found the gas station easily enough. It was the last building before the forest swallowed everything. The structure itself was collapsing inward, its roof partially caved in. Ancient gas pumps stood like rusty sentinels, their hoses long since rotted away. I pulled the truck around behind the building, parking it out of sight from the main road. Not that I expected anyone to pass by, but something about the place made me cautious. The silence was profound, broken only by the ticking of the truck's cooling engine and the whisper of wind through empty buildings. I stepped out into air that smelled of decay and pine. My boots crunched on gravel littered with broken glass and rusted metal. The sun was already low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rust that matched the decaying town. I had maybe 2 hours of good daylight left, enough to reach the cabin if I moved quickly. My backpack was heavy, loaded with tools I'd need for basic repairs. A hammer, nails, wood sealant, a manual saw. I'd also packed camping gear, including a tent, sleeping bag, a small propane stove, and enough food and water for 3 days. Strapped to my belt was a hunting knife that had belonged to my grandfather. I'd never used it for anything more serious than opening boxes and cutting rope, but having it felt reassuring. The trailhead was exactly where the map indicated, marked only by a barely visible gap between trees. I took one last look at the abandoned town, at the truck sitting alone behind the gas station, and then stepped into the forest. The trail was overgrown, barely more than a game path. Branches reached across it like grasping fingers, forcing me to duck and weave. The canopy overhead was thick enough to dim the remaining daylight significantly. Within minutes, the abandoned town had disappeared behind me, swallowed by trees and undergrowth. Walking through those woods felt like moving backward through time. The forest was old growth, the trees massive and ancient, their bark rough and deeply furrowed. Some were easily 4 or 5 feet in diameter, their lowest branches starting dozens of feet above my head. The understory was dense with ferns and brambles, creating a green wall on either side of the narrow trail. Everything was damp, smelling of earth and rot, and growing things. I found the lightning-struck oak after about 20 minutes of hiking. The massive tree had been split down its center by some long-ago storm, the two halves leaning away from each other like dancers frozen mid-movement. The wood inside was blackened and hollow, creating a cave-like opening at the base large enough for a person to stand in. I paused there, checking my map and taking a drink from my water bottle. The silence of the forest was different from the silence of the town. It wasn't empty. I could hear birds calling to each other, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth, the distant rush of water. But there was a weight to it, a presence that seemed to press down from above and rise up from the earth simultaneously. I'd spent plenty of time in the woods before, had gone camping and hiking throughout my 20s, but this felt different somehow. Older, wilder. The creek crossing came next, exactly where it should be according to the map. The water was shallow but swift, running over smooth stones that were treacherously slippery with algae. I crossed carefully, using a fallen log as a bridge, my arms spread wide for balance. On the far side, I paused to catch my breath and check my bearings. That's when I first felt it, that sensation of being watched. It started as a tickle at the base of my skull, then spread down my spine like cold water. I turned slowly, scanning the forest behind me. Nothing moved except the wind-stirred leaves. No eyes gleamed from the shadows. No branches cracked under hidden weight. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger rather than fading. I told myself it was just nerves. The natural unease of being alone in an unfamiliar wilderness as darkness approached. I'd read somewhere that humans evolved an oversensitive threat detection system. Better to imagine a predator that isn't there than to miss one that is. This was just that ancient programming, activated by isolation and fading light. But my hand still moved to rest on the handle of the hunting knife as I continued up the trail. The bear-shaped boulder marked the final landmark. It was exactly as described, a massive piece of granite, easily 12 feet tall, that looked remarkably like a bear hunched on its haunches. Time and weather had given it features that seemed almost intentional. Indentations for eyes, a protruding knob for a snout, even smaller rocks at its base that suggested paws. In the dimming light, it looked disturbingly alive. From the boulder, the cabin should be visible within a few hundred yards. I pushed forward, eager now to reach my destination before full darkness fell. The trail widened slightly, and then I saw it through a gap in the trees. My father's cabin. It stood in a small clearing, perhaps 50 feet across, surrounded by towering pines. The cabin itself was smaller than I'd imagined, maybe 20 feet by 30 feet, built from hand-hewn logs that had weathered to a silvery gray. The roof was covered in cedar shakes, many of which were missing or broken. Vines had climbed the walls, their leaves turning brilliant red in the autumn air. A stone chimney rose from one side, its mortar crumbling in places but still intact. My father had built this with his own hands in the early 80s, back when the town still had a few hundred residents and there was hope that the lumber mill might reopen. He'd lived here for nearly a decade before whatever happened. Whatever he never wanted to talk about drove him to leave and never return. I approached slowly, taking in every detail. The windows were intact, miraculously, though coated with grime and spider webs. The door hung slightly crooked on its hinges, made from thick planks that had been fitted together with obvious skill. There was no lock, just an old iron latch that lifted easily. I pushed the door open. The hinges shrieked in protest, a sound that seemed obscenely loud in the forest quiet. The smell hit me immediately. Mustiness, decay, animal droppings, and something else, something sour and unpleasant, I couldn't quite identify. I pulled a flashlight from my pack and switched it on, sweeping the beam across the interior. The cabin was a single large room, maybe 15 by 20 feet. Against one wall stood the remains of a bed frame, its mattress long since rotted away or dragged off by animals. A small table and 2 chairs occupied the center of the space, both covered in dust and debris. The wood stove squatted against the back wall, its iron surface spotted with rust but still solid-looking. Shelves lined another wall, most of their contents long since fallen or been scavenged. But it was the trash that dominated the space. Someone, or multiple someones, had used this cabin, probably as a shelter. Empty food cans lay scattered across the floor, their labels faded and peeling. Torn plastic bags had been stuffed into corners. A pile of old newspapers dated from 2014, yellowed and brittle. There were signs of campfires on the wooden floor, black scorch marks that made me wince thinking about how easily this whole place could have burned down. The sun was setting rapidly now, the light through the windows turning orange and then red. I didn't have time to clean everything tonight. Instead, I focused on creating a small clear space along one wall, sweeping away the worst of the debris with a branch I found outside. Once I had an area about 6 feet square, I rolled out my sleeping bag and set up my camping lantern. As darkness fell completely, I sat on my sleeping bag and ate a cold dinner. A sandwich I'd packed that morning and an apple. The cabin's walls blocked the wind, but they also seemed to amplify every sound from outside. Branches scraping against the roof, an owl calling, the rustle of something moving through the underbrush nearby. Each sound made me pause mid-chew, listening intently. I tried to imagine my father living here, young and strong, building a life in this isolated place. Had he sat right where I was sitting, eating his own dinner by lamplight? Had he looked forward to the solitude, or had it eventually driven him away? I realized how little I actually knew about his life before I was born, before he met my mother and settled into suburban normalcy. Sleep should have come easily. I'd been awake since 5 that morning, and had hiked 2 miles with a heavy pack. But instead I lay in my sleeping bag, eyes open, staring at the dark ceiling. That feeling from the woods had followed me into the cabin, that sensation of being observed. I kept imagining I heard breathing other than my own. Footsteps on the porch, hands testing the door. Every 30 or 40 minutes, I'd drift into an uneasy doze, only to jolt awake moments later with my heart pounding, certain that something had changed, that some new threat had materialized. Each time, I'd grab my flashlight and sweep it around the cabin, finding nothing but shadows and debris. It was going to be a long night. I gave up on sleep around 5 in the morning. Gray pre-dawn light was just beginning to seep through the grimy windows, turning everything into dim silhouettes. My body ached from tension and the hard floor. My eyes felt gritty and sore. I'd gotten maybe 3 hours of actual sleep, scattered across the 7 hours I'd spent lying there. I fired up my camping stove outside the cabin. I didn't trust using it indoors until I'd checked for gas leaks and made coffee with water from my canteen. The routine of it helped calm my nerves. Screw open the stove. Attach the small fuel canister. Light it with a match. Fill the pot with water. Wait for it to boil. Add the instant coffee. The familiar steps grounded me. Reminded me that I was still in the normal world. The rational world, not some nightmare realm where shadows had substance and silence had teeth. The coffee was terrible, but hot, and I clutched the metal cup in both hands, letting the warmth seep into my fingers. The forest was waking up around me. Birds began their morning chorus, starting tentatively and building to a full-throated concert. Somewhere nearby, a woodpecker hammered at a tree trunk. Normal sounds. Comforting sounds. I decided to take a walk, to clear my head and shake off the unease of the sleepless night. The sun wasn't up yet, but there was enough light to see by that gray, shadowless illumination of early dawn. I followed a deer trail that led away from the cabin, winding between trees and over fallen logs. After maybe 10 minutes of walking, the ground began to slope upward. The incline grew steeper, forcing me to use my hands in places, grabbing roots and branches to pull myself up. But when I reached the top, I understood why my father might have chosen this location for his cabin. The hilltop was a natural clearing, bare rock exposed by some ancient geological process, and from it you could see above the tree line for miles. The view was breathtaking. The forest stretched in every direction like a rumpled green carpet. In the distance I could make out the spine of mountains, their peaks already catching the first rays of sunlight, and much closer, perhaps 3 or 4 miles away, I could see Millfield. From this height and distance it looked almost picturesque, a small collection of buildings tucked into the valley, smoke rising from... Wait. Smoke? No, not smoke. But there was a light, a single point of illumination, clearly visible in the pre-dawn gloom. It appeared to be coming from one of the buildings on the main street, perhaps the old general store or the diner. As I watched, trying to determine which building it was, the light suddenly went out, extinguished as quickly as flipping a switch. My stomach clenched. Someone was down there. Someone else was in that abandoned town, in a building just a few hundred yards from where I'd parked my truck. I watched for several more minutes, but the light didn't return. Whoever was down there had either left that building, or was deliberately hiding their presence now. Part of me wanted to dismiss it. Urban explorers visited abandoned places all the time, documenting them, photographing them. It was probably just someone like me, drawn to the ghost town out of curiosity. But another part of me, the part that had kept me awake all night, wondered about the coincidence. This town had been abandoned for years, slowly decaying with no one around. And in the exact same few days that I decided to visit my father's cabin, someone else just happened to be exploring the town below. I stayed on the hilltop, watching the sun rise. The sky turned from gray to pink to brilliant orange, and finally the sun lifted above the distant mountains, flooding the valley with warm light. But no more lights appeared in the town below, and I saw no movement, no vehicles, nothing to indicate another human presence. Eventually, I made my way back down to the cabin, my mind churning. I needed to start work on the repairs. That was why I'd come here after all. But I also needed to remain alert, aware that I might not be as alone as I'd assumed. I spent the rest of the morning tackling the exterior of the cabin. The logs themselves were in surprisingly good shape considering their age. My father had chosen his wood well, probably old-growth cedar that could withstand decades of weather. But the chinking between them had deteriorated badly, leaving gaps that let in wind and rain and animals. I'd brought a caulking gun and several tubes of log home sealant. It was tedious work requiring me to clean out all the old crumbling material first, then carefully apply new sealant to each gap. I worked methodically, starting at one corner and moving along the wall, perched on a ladder I'd found inside the cabin. The work was mindless enough that my thoughts wandered. I kept thinking about my father, trying to imagine him young and idealistic, choosing this remote location for his home. What had he been running from? Or running to? Had he always been the quiet, cautious man I'd known? Or had something happened here that changed him? And I kept thinking about that light in the town, about the feeling of being watched. Every few minutes I'd glance over my shoulder at the tree line, scanning for any sign of movement. The forest remained still, innocent, revealing nothing. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger rather than weaker as the day progressed. It was as if the woods themselves were alive and aware, watching me with ancient, patient eyes. By early afternoon, I'd completed one full wall. My shoulders ached, and my hands were cramping from squeezing the caulk gun. I decided to take a break, eating lunch, sitting on the cabin's front step, more sandwiches and an orange. That's when I noticed the tracks. They were in a patch of soft earth near the corner of the cabin, where rain runoff had created a muddy depression. Boot prints fairly fresh. Certainly not from me. Mine had a distinct tread pattern, and these were smooth-soled, almost like dress shoes. Someone had been standing here, right at the edge of the clearing, probably within the last day or two. I knelt beside the prints, my heart rate accelerating. There were several of them, overlapping, as if someone had stood in this spot for a while, shifting their weight but not moving away. The prints faced the cabin. Whoever made them had been standing here, watching the cabin. When? Last night, while I lay awake inside? Earlier today? While I worked? Or days ago, before I arrived? I stood slowly, scanning the tree line again with new intensity. The forest stared back, silent and inscrutable. I should have left then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to pack up and hike back to the truck, to get the hell away from this place. But stubbornness kept me rooted. Or maybe it was pride, or a sense of obligation to my father's memory. Whatever it was, I decided to stay, to finish what I'd started. But I also brought my knife inside and kept it close as I worked through the afternoon, repairing the door hinges and replacing broken window glass. By the time the sun began setting, I'd accomplished more than I'd expected. The cabin's exterior was sealed, the door hung properly again, and most of the broken windows had been patched or replaced. The interior still needed work. I hadn't even begun cleaning up all the trash, but at least the structure itself was weatherproofed. I gathered firewood from fallen branches around the clearing, building a substantial pile outside the door. Then, with some trepidation, I attempted to light a fire in the wood stove. The chimney might be clogged or damaged, or home to a family of birds or squirrels. But I got lucky after some initial smoke. The draft caught, and the fire drew properly, filling the cabin with warmth. I positioned my sleeping bag near the stove, and settled in for the night, eating a dinner of canned soup heated on my camping stove. The fire crackled and popped, familiar and comforting. Outside, darkness pressed against the windows, absolute and complete. There were no streetlights out here, no ambient glow from distant cities. When I turned off my lantern, the only light came from the dancing flames visible through gaps in the stove's iron door. I was determined to sleep better tonight. The fire would keep me warm, and I'd actually accomplished something today, which gave me a sense of achievement and safety. I told myself the boot prints had probably been there for weeks, left by whoever had been using the cabin before me. There was nothing to worry about. I almost believed it. I must have drifted off around 9 o'clock, because when the sounds woke me, my watch read 11:47. At first I wasn't sure what I'd heard. I lay still, listening, my mind emerging slowly from the fog of sleep. Then I heard it again. Footsteps. Not the soft pad of an animal, but the distinct crunch-crunch of boots on fallen leaves and twigs. Someone was walking through the clearing, approaching the cabin. I sat up slowly, hardly breathing. The fire in the stove had burned down to embers, casting a faint reddish glow. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. The footsteps stopped. They were close now, maybe 10 feet from the front door. I waited, every muscle tense, trying to understand what was happening. Who would be out here at midnight? Why would they approach the cabin so openly? Then came the knock. 3 slow, deliberate raps on the wooden door. And a voice. Male. Older, rough with an accent I couldn't quite place. Hello? Anyone home? I didn't answer. Didn't move. Barely breathed. The voice came again, slightly louder. I'm looking for Thomas. Thomas Brennan. This is his cabin, isn't it? Thomas Brennan. My father's name. This stranger, whoever he was, knew my father. How? Why was he here? Thomas? It's been a long time, friend. Saw smoke from your chimney and thought I'd stop by. Against my better judgment, I found myself moving toward the door. The pull to know more about my father, to talk to someone who had known him here, was overwhelming. My hand reached for the latch, but something stopped me. Some primal survival instinct, stronger than curiosity, stronger than grief. The voice was wrong. The words were friendly, but the tone beneath them was not. It reminded me of honey poured over rot, sweet on the surface but corrupted underneath. I spoke instead, my voice sounding strange in my own ears. "Who are you?" There was a pause, a long one. When the voice came back, it had changed subtly, the friendliness receding. "I'm an old friend of the man who built this cabin. Was hoping I'd get to see him again." "What's your name?" I asked. Another pause. "That's not important. What matters is I knew Thomas. We go way back. Now why don't you open up and we can talk proper?" "My father's dead," I said, the words feeling heavy in my mouth. "He passed away in January." The silence that followed was different, deeper, as if the person outside was processing this information, recalculating. "I'm real sorry to hear that, kid." The voice had changed again, losing its attempt at warmth entirely. Now it was flat, mechanical. "Wish I could have seen him one more time. But maybe you and I can still have a chat. Why don't you open up? It's real cold out here, son. Would be nice to share that fire." The word son made my skin crawl. There was possessiveness in it, an assumption of familiarity he hadn't earned. "I don't know you," I said. "I think you should leave." The door shook suddenly, violently, as whoever was outside struck it with something, a fist, maybe, or a boot. The sound was explosive in the small space, making me jerk backward.
"Kid, open the door."
The voice had dropped all pretense now, becoming hard and demanding. "You going to let me die out here in the cold? That what your father would want from you? After I came all this way?" I backed away further, my hand tightening on the knife. "Go away. I mean it. I'm armed." This triggered another violent assault on the door. The wood shuddered under repeated blows, and I heard the crack of splitting timber. The door was solid, thank God my father had built it well, but it wouldn't withstand this kind of punishment indefinitely. The assault continued for what felt like hours. Sometimes it was violent, crashing blows that made the whole cabin shake. Sometimes it was quieter, scratching at the wood, testing the hinges, trying the windows. And always there was the voice. It cycled through different tactics, pleading, "Please, I'm hurt. I need help. Just let me in to warm up." Threatening, "I know you're alone out here. No one's coming to help you. Open the door." Cajoling, "Your father would be ashamed of you, treating an old friend this way." But mostly it was the threats, growing more explicit and disturbing as the night wore on. Descriptions of what would happen when he got inside, promises of pain and worse. The voice seemed to take pleasure in my fear, feeding on it. I crouched in the farthest corner from the door, knife held in front of me, fighting the urge to simply collapse into panic. The embers in the stove had died completely, plunging the cabin into absolute darkness. I didn't dare turn on my lantern. I didn't want him to see me moving, to know exactly where I was in the room. Around 3 in the morning, the attack stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noise had been. I strained my ears, trying to hear any sound that might tell me where he'd gone. Nothing. Just the normal night sounds of the forest, insects and distant animals. But I knew better than to relax. He could be anywhere, standing just outside the door, waiting for me to emerge, circling the cabin, looking for a weak point, or retreating to watch from the trees, patient and cold. I stayed in my corner, knife ready, and waited for dawn. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten when I finally heard something. Footsteps moving away from the cabin. They didn't rush or hurry. They were steady, unhurried, fading gradually into the forest, and then they were gone. I waited another hour, watching the windows gradually brighten as the sun rose. Every instinct screamed at me to stay hidden, to wait for full daylight and confirmation that he was truly gone. But another part of me knew that staying was suicide. He could come back with tools, with help, with fire. I had to leave. Now, moving as quietly as possible, I stuffed everything I could into my backpack. I didn't bother with organization, just shoved items in frantically, sleeping bag, stove, remaining food. The tools I left. I could replace tools. I couldn't replace my life. I crept to the door and pressed my ear against it, listening. Nothing but birds and wind. I lifted the latch slowly and eased the door open a crack. The clearing was empty. Morning mist hung between the trees, turning everything soft and dreamlike. There was no sign of the man, no figure waiting in the shadows. I stepped out, scanning constantly, the knife still gripped in my hand. The pile of firewood I'd gathered had been scattered, kicked apart in apparent frustration. And there, in the dirt near the door, I saw boot prints, the same smooth-soled prints I'd found yesterday, but many more of them now, showing his pacing and circling throughout the long night. I started down the trail at a fast walk that quickly became a jog. Every sound made me flinch. Every shadow could be him. The 2 miles to the truck felt like 20. But I made it. The gas station appeared ahead, still abandoned, still silent. And there, behind it, was the truck, untouched, exactly as I'd left it. I nearly sobbed with relief. I threw my pack in the passenger seat, started the engine. It caught immediately, thank God, and drove. I didn't stop in Millfield, didn't slow down. I just kept driving, faster than was probably safe on those narrow back roads, putting as much distance as possible between me and that cabin. It wasn't until I reached the interstate, merging into the blessed normality of highway traffic, that I finally allowed myself to breathe. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. My whole body felt like it might vibrate apart. I drove straight home, 7 hours without stopping except for gas. I kept checking my mirrors, irrationally convinced that somehow he was following me. But there was never anyone there, just normal cars full of normal people going about their normal lives. I've been home for 3 weeks now, and I still can't sleep properly. Every time I close my eyes, I hear that voice outside the door, cycling through its terrible variations. Every unexpected knock makes me jump. I've started keeping lights on at night, and I've installed additional locks on my apartment door. I've tried to research Millfield, to find out what happened there, why my father left. But records are scarce. The town just died, the way small towns sometimes do. The lumber mill closed in the late 80s. People moved away for work, and eventually there was no one left. Nothing dramatic, nothing to explain the evil I encountered. I'll never know who that man was, or how he knew my father. I'll never know if their friendship was real, or some delusion or lie. I'll never know what he wanted from me that night. Though I have dark suspicions I try not to dwell on. What I do know is that my father left that place for a reason, and he never went back for a reason, and he never told me about it for a reason. He was protecting me from something he understood but couldn't explain. Some knowledge that couldn't be shared, only experienced. The cabin still stands there, I suppose, in its clearing in the dead woods. The repairs I made will help it survive a few more years before rot and weather finally claim it. Maybe someone else will find it someday. Will see it as I first did, a project, a connection to the past, a peaceful retreat. I hope they're smarter than I was. I hope they leave before darkness falls. I hope they never hear that voice calling from outside the door, speaking their father's name with false familiarity, demanding to be let in. Because I know now, with bone-deep certainty, that whatever was out there in the woods that night was not looking for an old friend. It was hunting. And if I had opened that door, if I had let my grief and loneliness override my instincts, I would never have left those woods alive. The deed to the cabin is in a drawer somewhere in my apartment. I haven't touched it since I got back. I'll never return there, never try to finish the work I started. That place, whatever it is now, whatever it's become, is no longer my father's. It belongs to the forest, and to whatever walks through those woods at night, knocking on doors and calling out names it has no right to know. Let it rot. Let the forest take it back. Let it sink into the earth and be forgotten. Some places are meant to stay buried, and some questions are better left unasked.